This is Career Coaching X's and O's, and I'm your host, Mark Anthony Peterson, the founder and thought leader at Ceyero-Consulting, a small business strategy and technology consulting firm. A small part of our practice is executive coaching. These episodes are the summation of some of those sessions. The title of today's episode is 7 Steps to Take If You Have Multiple Bosses. 7 steps to take if you are reporting to multiple bosses. But before we get into the episode, I'd like you to hear from our sponsor, homeproductadvisor.com.
Do you wish you had a service that would give you honest reviews and advice about home products? Welcome to homeproductadvisor.com. Our mission is to make your virtual online shopping journey less daunting by providing details about the best home products. HomeProductAdvisor.com will show you the best natural cleaning product brands for a healthier home, give you the comprehensive guide to sanitizing your home, and teach you how to repair your damaged furniture like a pro. To learn more, please check out our promo YouTube video on our website. Find us on the web at https://homeproductadvisor.com. HomeProductAdvisor.com, your source for reliable, trusted advice.
Welcome back to the podcast. As I mentioned, this episode is entitled 7 Steps to Take If You Have Multiple Bosses. Many of you work in matrix organizations or in horizontal administrative groups, which means you may have a primary boss and a secondary boss, a dotted line boss. So if you're in HR, you may be assigned out to a business unit and have an HR boss but report up to a general manager who runs the business unit. In some cases, you could have as many as 3 different bosses. A solid line reporting relationship and multiple dotted line reporting relationships, which means you're being pulled in every direction. Recently, I had a session with a junior executive that had a primary boss, but several dotted line relationships. And he was given a project that required all 3 bosses to be in alignment in order for him to execute on that project. Unfortunately, those bosses could not agree. To make matters worse, the senior executive for the organization was personally vested in this project. He had set up an advisory committee to help in accomplishing this goal before assigning it to my client. That external advisory committee, every time they met, they wanted an update, which meant my client had to provide an update. And unless he could figure out how to align the goals of his bosses, he was in the hot seat. He really needed some help. Here are the 7 things we did to help him resolve the conflict between his bosses and start to get momentum on his project. First, we defined his objectives. What was he trying to accomplish? What was his primary goal, secondary goal, and his tertiary goal? Why did we do that? Having a clearly defined objective within the project gave us insight on how to develop a roadmap to achieve it. It let us prioritize those objectives so that we could then make sure we were focused on the highest priority goals first and utilize the resources that we had to bear to achieve them. Having clearly defined goals also let us determine what was out of scope. Long-term, low-impact objectives don't need to be considered, and they don't need to be a distraction. You want your top 3 goals, you want them clearly defined so that you can know if you're winning or losing in terms of delivering the project on time and on budget. The second thing we did was to detail out where we thought each of his bosses stood within the organization. We wanted to determine their level of influence within the organization and where we thought their strongest relationships lie, as well as who were the individuals who could influence their decisions, both in terms of direct oversight and those who have indirect influence over that boss or manager. By mapping out where the boss stood and who had influence, both indirect and direct, it gave us the building blocks for an action plan. For example, if you know your direct boss has a mentor that's outside of the department that he or she respects, developing a relationship with that person can give you insights on how best to manage your manager. How? Because that person can give you insights into the things that your manager cares about the most. And if you help your manager deliver those top priorities, he or she will give you more leeway to deliver your top priorities, particularly when they overlap with other managers who have to influence your career. So now we had 2 of the 7 steps in place. We defined our objectives, and we'd done a map of where our bosses stand in the organization and determined who had direct and indirect influence over the people that could make a decision about the project you had to push forward. What was the third thing we did? We defined the decisions that had to be made for the project to go forward, and we mapped them back to those bosses. Who could make the decision to marshal the resources? Who could make the decision to get it scheduled? Who could make the decision to deprioritize other projects? We laid all those decisions down that were roadblocks to the forward momentum of the project and mapped them back to those bosses. Now the structure of our plan had a solid foundation. We knew the goals. We knew where our bosses stood in the organization. We laid out all the key decisions that had to be made for the project to move forward, and we mapped them back to those bosses. Now, the 4th step was to define all your relationship assets. As I mentioned in step 2, you want to know who has direct authority over your boss's decisions and those indirect influencers. Those people who, just because they're in the room, they're going to give you an opportunity to sway the decision. And once you know that and lay out your relationship assets relative to those 2 types of people, you now know what your networking plan is. If you have a relationship with the top boss, as my client did, he's working directly on a project that the senior executive cares about. That means he's in meetings with the senior executive without his direct bosses. He's also in meetings with the advisory committee. Those same people who are asking the senior executive to provide an update on this critical project, he's developing relationships with them as well. Those are assets. It may not feel like it when you're in the meeting getting grilled and being asked why the project is being delayed, but they are assets. You have a first name relationship with senior executives and his advisors on a project that could make or break your career. Those relationships can be leveraged, both direct and indirect, to get your project moving and get momentum. What's the 5th step? The 5th step builds on the 4th step. Now that we know what our relationship assets are, we can map out that networking plan. Lay out the plan to achieve the objectives that we laid out in step 1. Early in my career, I was put in charge of a small business unit that had 2 key objectives. Build and deploy B2C technology that leveraged my company's data, and build technology for the other divisions to help them do the same thing. As you can imagine, the larger groups did not want help. They didn't want you to come in and disrupt production systems that were required to deliver the profit for the company on a quarterly basis. So whenever I came knocking with ideas to improve on what was already working, I always got a cold reception. So how was I going to get that project momentum? I followed these same steps. And there were times when I had to use the direct authority of their senior managers, and there were other times when I had to leverage indirect influence by inviting those business managers, those general managers, to meetings with the CEO to talk about some of this technology. You see, I knew most of the general managers would give their left arm to spend a half hour with the CEO, to give him a chance to understand what their unit was working on and to hear some of these ideas in his presence. And whenever I could orchestrate a meeting like that and use it to lay out my objectives and set milestones and follow-up meetings, I often walked out of there with commitments from each one of them. I gave them a little bit of what they wanted. I got a lot of what I needed. It wasn't so much a quid pro quo type situation. It was a relaxed way of sitting down with a senior executive and helping those general managers understand where the long-term objectives lie. When it was clear to them, they saw that working on my projects would help them help the CEO, which would ultimately help their careers. And that's what I had to make clear for my client. What was the sixth thing that we had to lay out? When laying out your objectives, know where you can contribute to remove the log jam. You don't have infinite resources in an organization, certainly in a for-profit organization. And if you work in a matrix organization, everybody's sharing resources every day. So there are going to be times when you have to jump in to help your boss or your bosses remove the logjam in the work that they are pursuing in order to free up resources for your project. Okay, so now let's take a catalog of everything that we have laid out. You define your objectives. You know where your bosses stand in the organization and what decisions they can make. You have a list of your relationship assets, and you've mapped those assets to your key objectives so you know whose influence you need to harness in order to influence your bosses to give you the resources that you need. You also know where you need to personally contribute to help your bosses free up their log jams. So what's the last thing we have to do? The last step you need to take if you have multiple bosses and working on a project like this, where they have to contribute and be in alignment for you to get momentum. The final step is to prioritize the plan. Lay out the meetings that need to happen for you to get the key decisions for your project and prioritize them into short-term and long-term. Just like you did with your key objectives in step one, these meetings are the floor joists, the support beams that are going to connect your action steps to your objectives. And so you want to lay out the meetings in the order that they need to happen in order to deliver your short and long-term goals. I know it feels like we're writing a play, and most plays have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and very few start with the end first and then tell you the rest of the story. And that's very true. We're mapping out the steps to get you momentum, to get the right people in front of your bosses, to influence their decisions, and to give you what you need to get project momentum. And so you want to logically think out how that should play. When do you get your bosses in front of the CEO or the senior executive? When do you involve those committee members in a meeting to reward your boss for freeing up the resources you need to get project momentum? Because that reward gives him or her visibility, gives them an attaboy, a pat on the back, and an opportunity to talk about other projects that are important to their career, to people who are going to get them promoted. So if you understand what I'm saying there, we are laying out a plan that not only rewards you, but rewards the people who are part of your team and a part of the management infrastructure. Some people say surviving in the corporate world is like playing three-dimensional chess. And I guess some days it does feel like that. To me, it just means you have to pay more attention to all the assets you really have. To look at the glass as being half full as opposed to half empty. Well, this client and I have had 2 sessions. I'm looking forward to following up with him to see how these 7 steps helped him to manage the multiple bosses that were involved in his project. And when we have that session, I'll be sure to come back and talk to you about it as well. Before we wrap up, I'd like you to hear from the sponsor of this episode, Home Product Advisor.
Do you wish you had a service that would give you honest reviews and advice about home products? Welcome to homeproductadvisor.com. Our mission is to make your virtual online shopping journey less daunting by providing details about the best home products. HomeProductAdvisor.com will show you the best natural cleaning product brands for a healthier home, give you the comprehensive guide to sanitizing your home, and teach you how to repair your damaged furniture like a pro. To learn more, please check out our promo YouTube video on our website. Find us on the web at https://homeproductadvisor.com. HomeProductAdvisor.com, your source for reliable, trusted advice.
I hope you found this episode helpful. If so, hit subscribe. I know you're going to share this episode with your colleagues because the best people listen to this podcast. If you're struggling in a matrix organization, having trouble managing 2 or 3 different bosses, then let us help you implement these 7 steps that I talked about in today's podcast. As a matter of fact, the first session is on us. Just go to our website, ceyero.com, ceyero.com, and schedule a free consultation. If you like this podcast, you may like some of my other podcasts. Guerrillapreneur. If you are a business maverick and you're a David out there taking on Goliaths, that may be the podcast for you. Gigging, everything in the sharing economy. On that podcast, I interview CEOs, founders, market leaders, and market makers, and they are telling you the future of the sharing gig and platform economies. And finally, my newest podcast, The Strategy Doctor. Yeah, I'm no MD, but I do spend time in that podcast musing about the biggest companies and the strategies that they are deploying to create shareholder value. The most recent episode, Oprah Winfrey, in her own cable network. She just announced that she was selling 20.5% of the network to Discovery. Well, I have a different take on how she can generate shareholder value. So take a listen to the Strategy Doctor podcast. This has been Career Coaching X's and O's, and I'm your host, Mark Anthony Peterson, founder and thought leader at Ceyero Consulting.